Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on ecological drought and tribal drought resilience. My name is Britt Parker, and I'm a program manager with the National Integrated Drought Information System, or NIDIS, at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. I'm also joined today by Crystal Stiles, who's our Tribal Engagement Coordinator. This webinar is the fourth in a six-part series that seeks to raise awareness of ecological drought, share actions that strengthen ecosystem resilience and mitigate the impacts of drought, and highlight advancements in building tribal drought resilience and preserving natural and cultural resources. This series is co-organized and co-hosted by NIDIS and the USGS National CASC, which is the National Climate Adaptation Science Centers. Information shared in this series will build on the 2021 National Ecological Drought webinar series, which was also co-organized by NIDIS and the National CASC. And Crystal is going to be dropping a number of links in the chat as we go along. And the first will be a link to this past webinar series if you're interested. Before we begin, I want to provide a brief overview of NIDIS and the CASC for those who are not familiar with these programs. NIDIS was created by congressional law in 2006 with a mandate to help the nation prepare for, mitigate, and respond to the effects of drought. NIDIS achieves that goal through the development of regional drought early warning systems, through efforts to improve drought monitoring, prediction, and forecasting, as well as the support for effective drought planning and preparedness and assessing the impacts of drought. All of our work is done in collaboration with a wide range of partners at all levels. I encourage you to explore the U.S. Drought portal at drought.gov, which is the U.S. government's authoritative drought information website, including information on ecological drought and our work with tribal partners, which is guided by our tribal engagement strategy. Next slide, please. The Climate Adaptation Science Centers, also referred to as the CASCs, consist of 1 national and 9 regional centers shown here that cover the United States, the U.S. Caribbean, and the U.S. affiliated Pacific Islands. The CASCs bring together scientists and natural and cultural resource managers united under a common goal of helping fish, wildlife, land, water, and people adapt to a changing climate. The CASCs use an actionable science model to generate climate science and tools to help partners develop adaptation strategies that meet on-the-ground needs. They work directly with partners to identify priority issues, develop research plans, and produce impactful science projects. Next slide, please. Transitioning to our webinar today, since 2007, NIDIS has funded over 70 innovative and applied drought research projects through the Coping with Drought Competitive Grant Program. Today's webinar, Integrating Ecological Drought Consideration into Restoration Efforts and Natural Resource Management, highlights the outcome of 3 projects that were funded in FY22. Next slide, please. The focus will be on ecological drought research and collaborative efforts to inform the management of urban forests, as well as the protection of sacred springs and wetlands. I want to introduce our speakers now, and then we will get going. Our first presentation, entitled Building a More Drought Resilient Urban Forest Ecosystem, will feature Christy Rawlinson. Christy is a senior scientist in forest ecology at the Morton Arboretum, an independent botanical garden and research center located in the Chicago region. Christy's work focuses on connecting data and biological processes across spatial and temporal scales to inform climate adaptation for trees across environmental gradients. Our second presentation, Enhancing Water Retention and Facilitating Groundwater Recharge to Protect and Maintain Springs, will feature Dr. Claire Lay, who received her PhD in evolutionary and community ecology. Throughout her career, she has focused on statistics and strategies for managing, analyzing, and presenting complex data, and she also has experience in natural resource damage assessment and field ecology, toxicology, and climate. Our final presentation is Wetlands to Combat Drought, Strengthening Drought Preparedness on the Coeur d'Alene Reservation through Wetland Restoration and Monitoring. Our speakers will be Angelo Vitale, who's a graduate of the University of Idaho with degrees in biology and botany. He serves as the Habitat Division Lead for the Coeur d'Alene Tribe Fish and Wildlife Program, where he's worked since 1995, specializing in stream and wetland restoration within the homelands of the tribe. Althea Hagen is an associate professor of ecology and education in the forestry and environmental Conservation Department at Clemson University, where her research focuses on restoration ecology across ecosystems. She holds a PhD in interdisciplinary ecology from the University of Florida and teaches courses in environmental education and restoration ecology. Throughout the webinar, all participants are muted, so if you have questions for our speakers today, please submit your questions through Slido, which you should see in your WebEx panel. If your question is specific to one speaker, please note the name of the speaker in the question box. We will try to address a couple questions after each speaker as we have time, and then after all presentations, we'll have a longer Q&A session and discussion. So let's get started with our first speaker, Christy.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. I will be talking today about ecological drought in a system where maybe ecology isn't necessarily the first thing that comes to mind, but it is where the majority of people in the US and the world are interacting with nature and the environment, and that's in cities. Next slide, please. Like any research, especially the work that NIDIS has been so great about funding, it's never done by even just a few people. And this was such a great project because we were able to really connect across research teams and folks that are doing the applied side of adaptation in urban environments, particularly the Chicago Region Trees Initiative, which is the Morton Arboretum's branch of community forestry that are out there working with communities and working with individuals to plant trees and make our urban forests more drought resilient. Next slide, please. So I am a representative of the Morton Arboretum. We call ourselves the champions of trees. And so sometimes I forget that it can be important to take a step back and help remind people the roles that trees play in our lives. And even in a city that you might not think of as being particularly green, like Chicago, trees really play outsized roles for the variety of benefits they provide. They are really important to environmental health by regulating stormwater, air pollution, mental health. There's been a lot of evidence showing that, as well as reducing urban temperatures. But all of these benefits provided by urban trees, as well as other forms of urban nature or urban green space, they are really dependent on the health of those plants. And currently and into the future, drought is one of those really limiting factors about it. You can see in this picture on the right there, you've got decent sized trees growing in, shall we say, not decent sized areas. And because these roots don't, the trees, they get water through the roots, there's not a lot of space for it. Therefore, these trees can be very vulnerable to drought. Next slide, please. So the purpose of this project was to really kind of understand how drought is impacting trees in particular, but also kind of all of the greenness in urban areas across the wide variety of situations that we see in a place like Chicago. So what you see here in this map, this is the Chicago region. This is actually from June 2023. This is NDVI, Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, from the Landsat satellites. Dark green is lots of green, lots of plants, and that's particularly trees. That yellowish color is not a lot of green. And this is a pattern you see in a lot of different cities. So the white space on the top right, the Northeast, that's Lake Michigan. And as you move over to the east side of this region, the Chicago region, you get closer to downtown Chicago and you get less green. And then you've got these big patches of that dark green, which are urban forests in the sense of forested area, nature preserves in the Chicago region. Next slide, please. And so what we see here is that there is a lot of variation in greenness that is inherently just spatial, a function of land cover in particular. But we also know that green varies seasonally, as also with weather. When you get drought, different kinds of vegetation in different situations will lose their greenness and show drought impacts in that way. So because we can't, put sensors out across the entire Chicago region as much as we really wish we could, our group was really kind of thinking about, okay, we want to monitor drought across all of these situations. And that led us to thinking about satellite data as a way to get this wall-to-wall coverage. And then the other part of this is, okay, now that we have this information, what can we do for folks on the ground? And so there's also a big part of this that is thinking about drought resilience at that tree scale. Next slide, please. And this is really just kind of an illustration. All three of these pictures are actually from the Chicago region. So in this region, you've got those forests that are big trees, intact canopies, lots of open parkland kind of area, as well as kind of classic downtown conditions. And so trees growing in these have different exposures to drought based off of kind of these biophysical characteristics of the land covers that are found in Chicago, as well as many other cities in the US and world. Next slide, please. So what this is showing is are a couple of different things. So this is how greenness, NDVI, changes through time. And I'm glossing over all of the guts of the mathematical modeling we did here, but this is all derived using all of the Landsat missions, actually. We did some splicing together so that we could look backwards in time and applying a temporal smoother to it. So the black line is what you would normally see with greenness within a year. You know, over to the left of March, it's not that green. As you start hitting spring, it greens up. Greenness actually peaks in June, and then it often kind of has a couple different levels of greenness before it browns down. And then when you get into, in this region, October, November, things get significantly less green. We were fortunate enough to have a drought during this study period. It really kind of forced us to get going perhaps a little bit faster than we thought we were going to have to. And so what we're seeing here is the red is 2023, which was one of the driest springs we have had on record in the Chicago region. And for forest, spring happened like normal, actually about the normal time. It greened up, but because it was very, very dry until July, forests just never quite got as green as they normally do in the spring. And in urban medium, so this is kind of your typical suburban lot, again, spring happened more or less like normal, but what we see is that there was actually a loss of greenness as plants, particularly grasses that had flushed in spring, no longer had water to support. And this is a really great example of how the same conditions throughout the range are showing up very differently. Forests didn't necessarily lose any of their function that can be measured through greenness, but a lot of suburban areas did. Next slide, please. And you know, we can expand this out across more of the land cover types in the Chicago region, and you can see really kind of different patterns based on where you are. The urban environments, because they are grass dominated, they do tend to be a bit more sensitive to drought. Forests, less sensitive, but you do still see impacts. And one thing that was really interesting to us is working with Trent Ford, who's also on the call, is our state climatologist. A lot of this was driven by what Trent needs to help make these drought designations. And in a state like Illinois, a lot of our information about drought is driven towards and by agriculture. And if you look at these graphs, you've got cropland, which is in the upper left. You can see that all of these other ecosystems in the Chicago region respond very differently than crops. And so we really do have to be thinking about ecology and really kind of the ecology of different spaces. We can't understand drought in an urban environment by just relying on crops. Not all plants are the same. For all y'all plant people, hey, there's actually differences. But we can't even just rely on trees or forests either. We really have to think about this variability. Next slide, please. And hopefully someone can throw this in the chat in a bit. But because information is very limited, if you have to call me or one of our project team members on the phone to see what's going on, we have created a dashboard that is just for the Chicago region right now, where you are able to track greenness in near real time. It checks every day to see if there's new satellite data and update it. And so we've got a couple different levels to this, and we're still working on it. It's still in beta, but it's getting better. So right now, everything is kind of about normal for greenness, with perhaps urban open, so these kind of parklands being slightly greener than normal. Next slide, please. We have also built in several options that let folks play with the data themselves, especially so you can kind of compare what's going on this year, which is in a dark red color at the moment, part of what we're still tweaking and improving, to individual years. And so here I've got 2026 highlighted, 2025, which is last year, so you compare this year to last year, as well as 2023 and 2012, which were other drought years. And so it's this way to kind of help contextualize what you're seeing, not just against normal or other land cover types, but against other years that you know kind of what happened drought-wise. Next slide, please. And then we've also been doing some work, different ways of visualizing the data to help understand not just the state of greenness itself, but the trajectory it's on. And so this is showing whether things are currently getting greener or browner, both this year as well as in comparison to other years. And then we've got some work with the anomaly of that trend. So are you getting greener faster than normal, or are you getting browner faster or slower than normal? And a lot of this was kind of oriented to help you tease apart not just greenness, but what you would expect for the time of year, since green is very temporally dynamic. Next slide, please. And so right now we've mostly worked with this by land cover type to kind of simplify our thinking. We have developed a spatial methodology using spatial smoothers, taking our temporal logic and applying it spatiotemporally. But unfortunately, we haven't gotten it fully implemented for the drought monitor yet. Next slide, please. And so I'll try to go through this fairly quickly because the other whole part of this was connecting these system levels exposure, what we're seeing across the whole urban area, to what's happening at a tree level. Because urban forestry is implemented at a tree by tree scale due to the heterogeneities of the urban environment as well as ownership. So in order to do anything kind of future oriented and adaptation oriented, you really have to drill it down to individual trees. And when we're thinking about the future and drought resilience, one of our biggest levers there are kind of two levers we can pull. One is watering. We can tell, we can advise people to go out and, hey, water your tree and not just your yard. But if we're thinking long-term, it's about planting trees that will be drought resilient, that have low sensitivity to drought. Next slide, please. And it turns out that understanding what a drought-tolerant tree is not as straightforward as you might want. So we thought, oh, hey, just synthesizing drought tolerance designations for common species in Northeast Illinois won't be a problem. I actually didn't go through this list of species to cherry pick ones that had different drought tolerance designations across some of the most common references for urban trees. It's just that maddeningly different. So for example, silver maple, we have 3 of them in my yard in the Chicago suburbs. If you talk to Missouri Botanic Garden, if you look at some data, it says, oh, it's tolerant or moderately tolerant. But if you look at the USDA, it says, hey, this is drought sensitive. So as we were going through, what we thought was going to be a fairly quick and dry qualitative analysis needed some more information behind it. Next slide, please. And part of this is because drought tolerance isn't any single part of the tree. It's this kind of squishy characterization that really makes you have to think about the whole tree, because plant water use relations are everything from what's happening below ground, in the soil, in the roots, up through the stem, and out through the leaves. One of the co-PIs on this project was Luke McCormick, who's our root biologist, and he always starts with the roots. Next slide, please. And roots are important, and there are a lot of traits that are important, but it turns out that leaves are far easier to go grab and measure than roots, especially in urban systems where soil can be so compacted that it's literally harder than concrete. Next slide, please. So what we did is we went through both the available literature and then plant trait databases to pull a particular trait called turgor loss point. And that's basically wilting. It's how much tension can there be on the water column before things give up and wilt. Next slide, please. And so we had, over the past couple of years, Luke and Jake Misbauer and our research assistants and students went out and collected this kind of wilting point trait for dozens of more species. Next slide, please. And so this is really able to help fill in the gaps at different levels. So if you want to get all technical about it, we were measuring leaf water potential at turgor loss point. And what we see here is across the species we measured, we do get this gradient, and it helps give us some numbers to anchor in what has to be qualitative or at least categorical assessments. And so here we've got things like birches, which are in the tree world notably sensitive to drought. And so we see them up there with scores that are typically more drought tolerant. And things like oaks, they're native to the Midwest. They are known to or associated with much drier environments. And so this really helps fill in the gaps. But because it is a temporally and physically demanding process to get this data, what we're able to do is use this to kind of help anchor in species and then fill in using expert elicitation. Next slide, please. And so at the end of the day, that part of our project team reviewed over 200 species for Northern Illinois, and we were able to come up with these updated drought tolerance designations. One thing we want to be clear is because drought sensitivity is a product of so many traits, some of which their expression can be really influenced by the environment in which they're growing in, and these biological abiotic interactions. We feel pretty good about our drought designations for Chicago. What we are being very cautious about saying is you don't want to say, hey, the Morton Arboretum says silver maple is moderately tolerant, but perhaps you're trying to grow it down in Texas or something like that with a very different drought regime characteristics of your drought. So one thing we're interested in for the future is figuring out how we can crosswalk some of these a bit more spatially so we can share information in a more informative way. But for now, just for Chicago. Yes, no, the next slide was perfect. And we are disseminating this to the public. Right now, it's just by updating information on individual species through the Morton Arboretum's Plant Clinic, which is a free public resource. You can email them or call them, even if you're anywhere in the world, and they can help give you information and advice on trees and other plants. We also have a publication in review for the second time. Very excited about that. That will have a full table with these categorical and quantitative information. Next slide. And so this is all thinking about the future and urban drought resilience, really with the key to that being selecting the right tree, the right place, and the right care. So these species drought tolerance really help you find that right tree for the right place. And we're really hoping that the drought monitoring infrastructure can help you give it the right care by saying, if you're in this environment, right now we are seeing you are browner than normal, and it's really going to help if you can go out and water your tree or help its canopy or mulch it to help reduce some of that exposure to drought. Next slide, please. And then just a constant reminder that urban forests, you really do have to think at this long-term scale, but there are actions we can take now through proper planting and care that can set us up for urban drought resilience in the future. Next and last slide. And again, this kind of work and enacting the information that we have developed really is a team sport that requires a diversity of expertise, a diversity of perspectives. And I really want to thank NIDIS for funding us.
Thank you so much.
That's what I got.
Thank you. And we're running a little bit behind, so I'm going to save questions until the end. As we transition to our next speaker, Althea, can you just come on for a second? Let's test your audio so we have time to troubleshoot. Althea, can you come on for audio really quickly? Okay, it looks like we still need to troubleshoot that. No worries. So thank you, Christy. Now let's hear from our second speaker, who is Claire Lay. And Claire, it looks like you're still muted. There we go.
There we go. Sorry, it wasn't clicking for some reason. Thank you, everyone. And thanks, Britt and Crystal, for organizing this. So I'm going to be speaking about the Pueblo de San Ildefonso's project to work on their springs and improve the drought resilience of their springs. Next slide, please. So across the entire world, springs are one of the places that gets most impacted when climate change occurs and when drought occurs. Springs are just locations where water bubbles up from the ground, from groundwater to the surface and begin to flow. They, especially in dry areas, can be hotspots of biological diversity and places that a lot of different things live that might not be able to survive in the surrounding areas where it's drier. When climate change and drought begin to impact springs, the aquifers go down, and that means that the emergence points of springs might move. They might have greatly reduced flow, and in some cases, they dry up completely. So the Pueblo de San Ildefonso was interested in understanding the condition and doing things to improve the recharge rates and the ability of their springs to withstand drought for culturally and ecologically important springs. The goals were to protect their springs from droughts, to help sustain wildlife and native vegetation, and also to ensure that the Pueblo community could visit and use the springs, particularly their sacred sites, for traditional and cultural practices. Next slide, please. So these four springs are located near both Santa Fe and near Los Alamos National Laboratory. Because of that location near Los Alamos, they actually have had ongoing monitoring for a very long time to measure things like chemicals in the water and flow. So these four springs have a variety of accessibilities and a variety of traits, really. Next slide, please. Sorry, next. There we go. So the overall hydrogeology of the area is that there is a main aquifer that is below everything else, and there's some rock formations that are over the main aquifer, and then there is a perched water body that actually feeds most of the springs that are in the Pueblo. Next slide, please. So the grant tasks were to begin planning and implementation of spring restoration and to work with their neighbors, particularly Los Alamos National Laboratory and the surrounding communities on collaborative problem solving to protect the recharge areas. Recharge areas is just where water comes into the water table from outside sources. So they can be affected by things like sprinkler systems, by places where there's no way for water to get through the ground because there's a parking lot or something. Task 3 was to do monitoring and adaptive management on the work. And then task 4 was just reporting out to communities and conferences. Next slide, please. So there were some challenges to working in this area. For one thing, all of the sites were culturally and ecologically important, and we wanted to be able to maintain use for the Pueblo community and native species throughout the restoration process. Some of the sites are also pretty inaccessible. One of them is about an hour of riding on off-road equipment to get down to it. And another one is about a half an hour walk-in. So anyway, they aren't particularly easy to get to, and so those places needed some focused effort to remove invasives and continue monitoring efforts. Next slide, please. The first of the four springs is Sacred Spring. This location has been monitored and sampled since the 1950s. It's known to exceed the general water quality standards for manganese, and it has shown some wastewater compounds in some of those samples. It's also very heavily impacted by feral cattle, and as a result, it has eutrophication, where the water gets too high in nitrogen, and it also has some unstable banks. It has some invasive plants, but really the primary issue at the site is that cattle really like this spring. So the main goal here was to construct enclosures and fencing to eliminate feral cattle access to the spring, stabilize the banks that had degraded, and improve that overall nutrient profile of the springs. So the progress that they made on this over the course of the grant is that they were somewhat successful in excluding and removing feral cattle. It did eventually require engaging some cattle wranglers to get the cows away. But it also required multiple rounds of fencing construction. The cattle were very interested in getting to that water location, and it took a lot of effort to get them to stay away. They did remove some invasive trees around the area, and they used those to build more robust fencing and barriers. And then they monitored with wildlife cameras and saw that wildlife continued to use this spring throughout the entire process. Next slide, please. Sorry, next. So at this location, they engaged in biotic monitoring, again with game cameras, but also by arriving at the site with phone microphones turned on so that they could hear various wildlife sounds and record what kinds of birds were coming to the spring. And then their fence construction relied on a design to allow native wildlife passage to the spring, but did exclude cattle. And we have video footage of native wildlife accessing throughout. Next slide, please. All right, so this is just sort of an overhead location of the spring, and you can see here really clearly that there's pretty dry area further out, but as you approach the exit point of the spring, that's supporting a lot of vegetation. Here's some images of that cattle damage and the strategies that they attempted to use to keep the cattle out. They did use some cattle panels. That was fairly effective at keeping cattle out. It did make it a little bit more difficult for elk to access the site, but the elk were able to sort of get their heads down through or underneath the panels to access the spring. What did happen is that when they excluded the cattle from the direct access point of the spring, they did get cows at other locations nearby where they hadn't had them before. So they did eventually, next slide, please, sorry. They did eventually decide to engage some cattle wranglers to help them remove those cattle. So their plan more or less worked. They were able to stabilize their degraded banks. And that initial fencing was unsuccessful in keeping cattle out, but they were able to redesign it, use more robust barriers, and get the wranglers to come to remove the cattle. So they do have those cattle panels up still, but they're finding that the wildlife are able to access it, and that that access to the outflow of the spring is prevented. But if they do have more cattle arriving, they tend to go to a very nearby pool. So they've done a lot of collaboration to remove those and have been moderately successful at this point in time. Next slide, please. La Mesita is the next location. This spring's primary challenge is that it is very surrounded by invasive Russian olive. Russian olive takes a lot of water, and it is very able to suck up so much water that it moves the water table and can increase the effects of drought on springs. What you can see from the overarching footage here is that very bright green on the picture on the right, that's the Russian olive. They have done some woody invasive removal, and in areas somewhat nearby, but not directly at the spring, they've planted New Mexico olive and juniper. Juniper can also impact springs by sucking up a lot of water, but the places that they've planted it are somewhat far away. Next slide, please. At La Mesita in 2004, they did some invasive removal. They cut the stumps at the outflow, and they've been working to keep the regrowth from coming back. One of the things about Russian olive is that once you cut a tree down, it can resprout for many years after. So they've been working to just knock that back consistently. Site access is fairly challenging at this location. It's a hike in, and then it is sort of down in a little gully, so it's a little bit difficult to get directly down to where they're removing things. But they have been able to do this with equipment that they bring in by hand and just a fair amount of manpower. They are also monitoring flow, wildlife, and plant cover with the game camera. And then at all the sites, they're using drones to monitor how they're doing with vegetation and whether they're having any real effects on the overall level of greenness and structure at the site. Next slide, please. So at this location, they are going to have to continue that Russian olive removal for some time. Again, Russian olive can resprout. Most of the large plants have been removed and shoot control is underway using manual methods. They've also removed some juniper shrubs in the area to facilitate the clearing. And their main difficulty here is that the accessibility of the spring is quite challenging. So they're going, and also it has a high fire risk. So they're going to have to be careful about when they remove that downed material and also about continuing control on the shoots. Next slide, please. All right, the next location is Sandia Spring. This is another area where one of the primary issues was invasive species. There is Russian olive, there's also salt cedar, or tamarix is the other thing that's known as. And both of those species are extremely invasive and can have a big impact on springs. There's also an invasive elm that likely is impacting the spring flow. So invasive vegetation removal was the biggest thing that needed to happen at this location, but it has a fairly large accessibility issue. The road or trail maintenance needed to happen before they could really get consistent access to the spring, as the road was on a place, it was at an area that had some unsafe entrance accesses to it. And the other thing that we wanted to be careful about with this location, because it is fairly remote, is that birds can become pretty dependent on invasive woody species. And so we recommended that they monitor and carefully time the removal of those species in order to maintain sufficient habitat for birds that were there. Next slide, please. So this is just some drone footage of Sandia Spring. That area that's circled in red on the right is the area where they've removed a fair amount of salt cedar, Russian olive, and also that invasive Siberian elm. And you can see that that's removed a fair amount of vegetation from directly around the spring. That's had a couple of benefits for them also, as they try to improve just access to the area so that they can continue monitoring it. Next slide, please. So they've removed those invasives and they've begun the process of shoot control. Shoot control on tamarix and Russian olive in particular is particularly complex. And they are planning a burn to destroy any of the salt cedar tamarix regrowth from the cuttings. They're also still working on road repairs to improve safety and to allow access to the spring. Next slide. All right, this is the last one. This is Vine Tree Spring. This one is interesting because the spring emergence point moves fairly regularly. It's also a location that has relatively high diversity and contains really rich native flora and fauna. At this location, there are some invasives present, but they're not currently overwhelming the native species. Rather than having Russian olive as the primary vegetation that's near the spring, this location has New Mexico olive. So in this location, the recommendation was just to expand monitoring to focus on accounting for that emergence point shifting with available water, and also to continue monitoring the spring for the species that are present there to make sure that they're not losing things over time. Next slide, please. Here, they're also doing some flow monitoring, both by using site visits and game cameras so that they can know whether that spring is moving because of changes in the water table, or if potentially they're having some issues with just missing where it's exiting because it is a fairly dense location. They're also doing at all of the locations some bird monitoring where they have audio recording and game cameras because at this site, it's particularly important because that dense vegetation can make the birds hard to locate. So they're using the BirdNet API to identify things that are there. And they found some interesting things, some pretty typical things, and also Townsend solitaire, which is common in the area. I've showed this graph before, and I'm just going to mention it really quickly since we're talking about this location. You can see that the flow increased a lot in 2009. There was a flood in the area in that year, and then it resulted in higher rates of flow for a couple of years. But there's been a pretty steady decline after that. So that monitoring for flow is something that they're particularly concerned about. Next slide, please. Sorry, next slide. I don't think I can change it. Okay. They're going to be ongoing monitoring at all of the sites. They do regular water quality monitoring with a YSI meter. They also do quarterly water sampling and lab analysis to monitor things like wastewater incursion and also some of the chemicals that are associated with the development at Los Alamos National Laboratory, Department of Energy. They're also using game cattle at the springs to capture flow, identify times when feral cattle arrive so they can more quickly control them, and just to pay attention to wildlife utilization to see what they're getting at. And then they're doing annual drone orthophotography to track vegetation coverage around the springs. Next slide. Reporting, the Pueblo attended the National Tribal and Indigenous Climate Conference in Anchorage in 2004. And is working on reporting back to the community. And I apologize, I noticed that there's some out-of-date things on this slide. The website editions are done, they're just waiting to be added. So hopefully those will be released sometime in the next 6 months or so. And then there's just some nice photos here of the team working on the vegetation clearing at all of these locations. Thank you. Next slide. There are several contacts here in case you're more interested in more information. And other than that, I will turn it back over to Britt.
Thank you, Claire. Okay, we are going to cross our fingers that Althea, do you want to give it a shot? Can we hear you?
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, thank goodness. Okay, so our final presentation will be given by Angelo and Althea, and I'll turn it over to the two of you.
Thank you for making this platform available to us. And thank you for joining us on the web here. We're going to be talking about the Coeur d'Alene tribe's approach to climate resilience on the reservation. So you can advance the slide. This is the Coeur d'Alene Reservation is located in the panhandle of Idaho, and NOAA funded us to do both restoration, stream and wetland restoration actions, as well as install the monitoring infrastructure that was needed to document various responses to restoration. And we did these we set up both treatment and control sites in several watersheds of interest to the tribe. You can advance the slide. So like many areas in the Pacific Northwest, we're experiencing more intense drought as well as multi-year drought, which is pretty unusual some decades ago. And in our area, the average temperature has increased a little over 2 degrees centigrade over the last 100 years. Go ahead and advance. So our project goals were to restore capacity of wetlands to mitigate drought, enhance fish refugia, provide habitat for culturally important wetland plant and wildlife species, and to enhance cultural services by the tribes that have depended on these streams and wetlands for thousands of years. Go ahead and advance. So this is a video that we're going to play that was produced by some of the youth interns working on our project this past year. I think the volume, we're not hearing that.
Hey, Eleanor, I wonder if you need to unmute yourself. It was working earlier.
how important it was. My dad moved to the Coeur d'Alene and we didn't have salmon. But they talk about how important it was to the tribe to get that salmon back into Hanging Creek. It will fulfill our dreams to have it for our traditional feasts, for our powwows, for our funerals. My name is Ernie Stensgar. When I was growing up, Hanging Creek was I think it was very important to us at that time as a playground, but also as a food source. In the late 50s and early 60s, the creek was transformed by farmers. All the timber and cottonwoods cover was cut down. Our fish disappeared, the wildlife disappeared into farm fields. It was a tough time. Salmon was very detrimental to the tribe. It was very spiritual to the tribe. We were so happy and proud when we heard that they were going to bring the salmon back and introduce them into the creek. I look forward to the day that my kids will come down and spear salmon.
The goal and the purpose of what we're trying to do out here is we're trying to create the habitat for the return of salmon, as well as those native species that are in the creek. Salmon have been blocked for nearly a century from naturally entering the Coeur d'Alene Reservation. Where we're sitting right now, I would say, is the beginning of the Palouse, which is really rich soil, produces crops like nowhere else in the world. Early settlers knew this, and they've contributed to the loss of the water table, because if you want to farm right, you can't be having everything flooded out. The purpose and the goal of agriculture was to remove water off the landscape, and trying to reverse that has been one of our top priorities here. If you think about how everything works in cycles, the Coeur d'Alene tribe is trying to restore a keystone species in beaver. So we return beaver. That means that the creek's well enough to support fish. Trying to get back what was lost in the past protects our sovereignty, right? So we're able to pick up parcels of land that we're able to restore on our own. And using the knowledge of our ancestors, we believe that we can get it done the way that it's supposed to be done.
I ask that you would be with each and every one of our brothers as they're getting ready to be released into these waters, that you'll help them to get all the way to the ocean.
The elders, they got a physical connection with the salmon. They were around to see salmon, and the younger generation doesn't really have a connection at all. That's what we're working towards, is bringing that connection back to our people. My name is Brutus Saijan. I'm a Coeur d'Alene tribal member, and I work for Coeur d'Alene Tribal Fish and Wildlife Department. To date, the hatchery has released 25,000 salmon, and we're currently growing 5,000 salmon. The type of species of salmon we release are Chinook and sockeye salmon. There's a community side, like teaching the youth and kids and getting them out and doing salmon releases. And then there's the research side, trying to restore them back into the creeks. To be a part of the salmon reintroduction, it's really an honor for future generations to be able to fish salmon or see salmon again in the streams. It's what we're really working towards, and just trying to make your ancestors proud.
When they planted the first salmon, and you could hear the cheers from the people, and even the tears that were shed that day. It was so important to us.
Wasn't that awesome? Those are some big salmon.
Okay, you can advance the slide. Thank you. One more comment about the tribe's cultural connection to this work that we're doing. I was fortunate enough to work with Coeur d'Alene tribal elder Felix Aripa for the first 20 years that I worked for the tribe. And Felix is a tribal leader and also an engineer by training and vocation. And he would often describe himself as a beaver man from way back, which was kind of a funny thing to listen to him say in front of a big crowd of people. But in his own native language, he would use this phrase, quietet, which refers to beaver as our gift from the Creator. So that cultural connection definitely shapes our restoration approach here on the reservation. Go ahead and advance the slide. So briefly, the approach is to recreate historical conditions by re-wetting valley bottoms and restoring native vegetation. We refer to this as restoring the active riverscape. In the streams that we have been doing our work in, these are generally incised or entrenched within the valley bottoms, and these streams only occupy a fraction of the historic floodplain in these locations. And with restoration, you can advance the slide, we are trying to engage the valley with frequent floods that cover much of the historic valley bottom as well. Go ahead and advance the slide. So I think it's important to share the outcomes of this work and just to describe what drought resilience really looks like. And I don't think a lot of people maybe understand what that term means. But it's also important to talk about outcomes in with the understanding of how these complex processes begin to manifest over time. So this picture, in a few words, is what the active riverscape looks like. These photos were taken on the same day showing a restored reach with the 5-year flood covering the entire valley bottom, and immediately upstream of that restored reach, that flood is entirely contained within the active channel. So there's a significant difference here that can be seen immediately following restoration. Go ahead and advance the slide. While that river connection and valley connection helps to re-wet the valleys that we're working in, this is also a process that takes a little more time in some instances. We had our summer youth map the wet footprint in the valley bottom during the hottest period of the year, as shown here in the red, prior to restoration. And you can advance the slide. Immediately following restoration at this site, we increased that wetted footprint by about 100% by reconnecting historic meanders and off-channel wetlands. But more importantly, this works changed the hydrology enough so that beaver could reoccupy this site. Go ahead and advance the slide. And as beaver built a stable network of dams, they flooded the valley and increased that footprint by more than 5-fold. Go ahead and advance. And this is recreated very diverse wetland types that were fairly common historically, but are relatively rare on the reservation right now. Go ahead and advance. So we're also trying to monitor and describe improved water dynamics, storage dynamics at these sites. We have a series of groundwater wells. This is data from a well that's located fairly close to the channel. And the figure on the lower part of the slide, you can see data from that well. The y-axis shows the depth of groundwater below the valley bottom surface. And early in the year, waters, the groundwater level pretty much drops through the growing season. That groundwater becomes less accessible to vegetation. In this particular site, we began restoration in August of last year. And immediately following restoration, you can, as we plug the channel up, you can see that groundwater response and recovery right away. And go ahead and advance. And in the future, as we continue monitoring on this site, we expect groundwater to remain relatively higher and more stable through the growing season. Advance the slide. We also are using conductivity loggers to measure the wetting up and drying down of other wetlands on these project sites. In this instance, this wetland is fairly far removed from the channel, and prior to restoration was influenced primarily by upland water sources. The conductivity loggers work like a switch, essentially, with conductivity readings being fairly high when the site is wet, and then those conductivity readings being quite low when the site dries out. And what we expect to see now that this site is restored, you can advance the slide, is an extension of water through the growing season. So I'm going to turn this over now to Althea and ask her to finish us out. You can advance the slide.
One of the other things that we have been monitoring after the restorations is how wildlife has been using the site. So we have a lot of game cameras out, and I actually worked with some undergraduate students at Clemson to look at this data. And you can see the two paired graphs there. On the left is the control, where primarily we found wildlife was just crossing or moving through the site and not spending a lot of time foraging. And then in the treatment sites, the sites where restoration had occurred, there on the right, you can see a significant increase in the amount of foraging or time spent in the site. So they're not moving through the sites to get somewhere else. They're now staying in the site and using that as a foraging resource. Next slide. This summer, I am sending a graduate student out there, out to Idaho, and he is going to look at vegetation surveys, not just for the stream and wetland restorations that were funded by this NOAA grant, but because some of the wetland communities, as Angela showed in an earlier slide, take more time to develop than the 2 or 3 years we've been able to monitor these NOAA sites. He's going to visit sites that that were restored as early as 2006, which is 20 years ago now, and check on the vegetation communities and how their trajectories are changing and moving and hopefully shifting towards more wetland species as we move through time past restoration. So you can see we've got, I think, 8 sites he's going to be visiting this summer and collecting vegetation data and also soil data. And it's a time series throughout the last 20 years. Next slide, please. Here's an example of what his data collection will look like. On the left, he's going to be collecting quadrats, and in each quadrat, he's going to do stem counts as well as percent cover, and then a soil sample from the center of each quadrat to try to relate the soil. We're also going to use LiDAR to pull out some other characteristics so that we know, if the vegetation isn't wetland vegetation yet, maybe it was at a slight elevation within the site. Also aspect, since some of these sites do have hills or some topography to them, as well as slopes. So that's the data we are planning to collect and hopefully include in his thesis and a future publication. Next slide, please. Along with doing a general vegetation community survey that we just looked at, we're going to specifically look for some native wetland species that the tribe has identified as culturally important to them. One of the big ones we're looking for is camas. And so along with doing general vegetation surveys, he's also going to look for where camas is and come back later in the summer and do some more intensive sampling and environmental data collection so that there isn't a whole lot of literature out there about this plant, so that we can help figure out what environmental conditions really support it and help to shift restoration sites towards those conditions so that the tribe can have more of this culturally important species located on their reservation. Next slide. So one of the things we're asked to provide, and I know we're running out of time here, is some advice. So Angela and I have been working on this grant for quite a few years now, and we would suggest choosing fewer variables, but really doing it well, using cultural knowledge to inform the restoration techniques, like he spoke about, using the beaver and thinking about creating streams that could support salmon and other species that are important to the tribe. And then thinking about the response times of the variables we're monitoring, hoping to monitor change in vegetation doesn't change, particularly when we're in drought conditions like we are this year and last year. It doesn't necessarily change or shift in 1 year. You kind of need to look at longer time scales. And I believe that is all we have. Time for questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. And Eleanor, if you will just put on the stay in touch slide if you can. We are over time and out of time for questions. I do have the questions that came in, and I will connect those asking questions with speakers to get their questions answered. But thank you to all of our speakers today. Our next webinar will be May 13th, and we hope you'll register. The link is in the chat, and join us. And if you want to stay in touch with NIDIS, Crystal has put a link in the chat to subscribe for the various emails from our regions and tribal work. So thank everybody very much, and hopefully we'll see you on our next webinar on May 13th. Take care and have a great day.